afternoon, good evening to anyone and everyone who is joining us for this very exciting session in which we are presenting in one part a joint undertaking together with Professor Mariana Mazzucato and her team, a report where UNDP and her institute have come together to look at COVID-19 and the need for dynamic state capacities and international comparison. And we're very privileged to be joined by panelists, the Minister of Education from Bangladesh, and I hope we will have also Dr. Kodjo Mensah-Abrampa with us from Ghana in a moment. I don't see him yet on the screen. And let me begin by first of all saying how grateful and how appreciative I am to my dear colleague and friend Mariana and her team, because we have been professionals working alongside each other for a number of years, and I have been inspired, I have been challenged, I have sometimes been made to raise self-doubts by some of the very insightful work that Mariana has brought to the debate about the role of the state. Many of us are familiar with the fact that we've spent the last 2-3 decades in almost a kind of oscillograph mode, where at one moment the state is the solution to all problems, and the next minute the state is a liability, and let markets and the private sector drive the future of development. I think anybody who has watched the world during this COVID-19 crisis, and it is a crisis that, dear colleagues, continues today as we speak in ways that are unprecedented. It is far from over. It is testing us at our most basic abilities to respond as individuals, as family members, as members of a society, a government, a corporation. And you will not be surprised if I also put the notion of this international community. I lead the United Nations Development Program. I am part of an idea born in 1945 out of tragedy of failure, namely that in order to master and be able to cope with some of the great crises and threats to the future of humanity, it is this fundamental principle of being able to work together that actually binds us together and enables us to do things that might not have been conceivable even a few years ago. The same applies for failures. But our discussion today is really focused around the notion of, is the state an entity that is more defined by its limitations than by its cerebral functions that it plays in our societies and economies? Or are we able to conceive of a 21st century state and state institutions that are integral, first of all, to something that we will touch on today, namely that notion of a social contract? Because in its simplest form, the state is a willingness of citizens to delegate certain authorities, responsibilities, and functions to an institutional construct that where we are fortunate enough to live in democratic societies, we elect. In others, there are other forms by which state authorities are constituted, but ultimately by some form of law, constitutional law or otherwise, we transfer certain responsibilities, authorities, and capabilities to the state institutions. And let us remind ourselves, the state is not only a ministry of planning, it is not only a prime minister or a cabinet, it is also the legislative arm, the parliaments that represent, so to speak, the will of the people, the choices that they wish governments and societies to make on their behalf, and also the judiciary and the rule of law. All three represent the promise of a social contract in which we as societies find ways in which to work and learn together. But in the midst of COVID-19, and what our study and our work has revealed is that there is contested territory here. Some of it is ideological, and let us recognize it for what it is, which is not to diminish it, but there are different worldviews, including on what level of inequality is a society willing to accept in the name of progress and development. Because much of what has challenged us in recent decades is precisely that value judgment in the name of economic growth. And we have been singularly narrowly focused on measuring progress through this lens of gross domestic product, income per capita, something that UNDP with the Human Development Reports has now for 30 years tried to continuously challenge, not in the sense of negating it, but rather to broaden the lens with which we allow citizens to judge ultimately what is progress. But it is also in understanding during COVID-19 how central our state institutions are to, one, managing a crisis, but perhaps more importantly, and this is part of our discussion, to also bring meaning and capacity and ability to build forward better. We know this pandemic at some point will cease to be a health crisis in the short term, but its tail, its consequences, the opportunities or the missed opportunities that it will create for societies across the world are premised significantly on where the role of the state will play out in what lies ahead. We know also that in the first few months we had this sometimes ironic situation where the very institutions that had called for a small state, and the largest amongst them, namely corporate actors, were the first ones to knock on the state institutions for assistance. The fact that many of our economic and financial stimulus packages in significant part were not mobilizing the extraordinary wealth of the financial markets and the corporate wealth in order to stabilize our societies, but turning to citizens as taxpayers in order to stabilize companies, corporations, manufacturing, infrastructure, I think was a first reminder that this is not an either-or world. Our markets, our industries, our small, medium-scale enterprises, and let us also remind ourselves that in an economy such as Japan, 98% or more of businesses are in fact small, medium-scale enterprises. We often talk about the state and the market and the corporate world as if it is an amalgam of large corporations. Most of our citizens across the world are in fact private sector entrepreneurs, but their ability to be able to develop their ideas, their markets, their products, their services is significantly premised on, first of all, legal frameworks that regulate how our markets function, legislation that enables or prevents innovations to come. And let me take you here to an example that many of you will have heard of. M-Pesa, that extraordinary platform for cash transfers and digital finance that Kenya developed. The reason why Kenya was a pioneer well over a decade ago here goes back to a singular decision by the central bank governor of Kenya at the time, in the name of a more inclusive financial system, to allow a private sector telephone company, if you want to put it at its simplest, to establish this platform that became such a transformative part of the financial system of Kenya, empowering people today to borrow money in the morning, to buy perhaps some vegetables in the wholesale market, sell them throughout the day and repay that loan instantly on their smartphone. The inclusive dimension of finance has been significantly shaped even by institutions that may have very little to do with that market trader, namely a central bank. Let us look also, and we will hear from Dr. Moni in a moment, about Bangladesh. UNDP has been an avid partner and student of the extraordinary digital innovations that Bangladesh has been experimenting with, not least the access to information platform that I'm sure, Dr. Moni, you might refer to. It has inspired us as UNDP to look across the world together with our colleagues in Bangladesh to share those lessons. If you take an announcement by the Indian government of a few months ago that one of the immediate consequences of seeing what was happening to people, especially those in villages across India, in these lockdowns, and the decision to try in the next 1,000 days to connect 450,000 villages to fiber optic cable, because there is that fundamental realization that digital infrastructure will be a fundamental variable both for managing crises such as the pandemic, but also in building forward better, has raised our levels of attention and ambition to the centrality of government being, as we have seen time and again in the history of development, to play a central role in creating the conditions within which markets, citizens, small, large-scale corporations can then play to their strength. The development of vaccines. Just look back over the last 14 months. We celebrate the extraordinary power of science and technology at this darkest moment in many ways that we have had for decades. This is not the result of just one scientist alone. It is not the result of one of the 6 big pharmaceutical giants. It is actually the product of a whole series of actors coming together. Research and development budgets, universities, scientists, collaboration with the private sector, AstraZeneca, despite some of the challenges, representing a partnership between a university and a large corporation, because it's not just the development of the vaccine that was central, it was then the ability to produce, mass produce and distribute. And this is, I think, what we are learning, where, you know, tools of government such as public procurement, and Mariana, you will speak to that, I'm sure, in a moment, become vital tools in the marketplace of our economies, but also in the way that we can invest upfront. It is not just infrastructure in a physical sense. It is the intellectual infrastructure. It is the scientific capability of our research community, our scientific community. It is the willingness, for instance, of you know, people across the world who put their money into savings accounts, into pension funds, and into investment funds, to demand of their financial managers to now invest these funds in a way that do not amplify the problems of the world, but actually help to solve them. Aligning, for instance, the world of finance, that extraordinary wealth that we have amassed, over $300 trillion in our generation, and align them with investments that allow our economy to invest in a low carbon energy infrastructure of the future, to allow our societies to develop social inclusion programs, to have social protection systems. These are all central functions of a state. And I will stop here because Mariana will in a moment speak very clearly to an entrepreneurial dimension of the state. I lead a public institution. I lead it within an organization that is 75 years old. Are we the paragon of, you know, agility and innovation every day? No, maybe not. We are a stabilizing factor in the world, but we are capable of acting with great agility. We can be innovators. And I myself have experienced that, because when I arrived in UNDP, I brought the idea that innovation should be something that is a means to an end. A development program of the United Nations like UNDP, present in 170 countries, needs to understand that the greatest ingenuity of innovation and how we can help states also to foster that lies within the communities, the entrepreneurs, the actors within the country. We launched a program of so-called UNDP Accelerator Labs in 1 year, covering 60 countries, in the second year adding another 31 countries. This is a public institution called UNDP that in 24 months established what we would like to think of as the largest learning network in development today. So agility is not something that is somehow impossible for us in public institutions to pursue. The question is, do we have the license to do so? Are we focused on actually seeking to operate our institutions in such a way? And do we understand that we operate within a larger ecosystem? Public, private, citizens, they form an ecosystem in which societies will either succeed or fail. And the lessons that this report presents are reflections in the midst of a crisis, but that allow us to think forward in ways that perhaps otherwise would result in us missing opportunities. That is my greatest concern at this particular moment in time. Thank you so much. And I think with that, I first hand over the floor to Dr. Dipu Moni, the Minister of Education of Bangladesh. And we will go through our program very quickly. So Dr. Moni, over to you. Thank you. Sorry, Dr. Moni.
Distinguished panelists, guests, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to begin by thanking Mr. Steiner for inviting me to speak today and congratulating the UNDP and University College London teams for organizing this timely discussion. Let me share Bangladesh's experience in responding to COVID, considering education and other sectors. Bangladesh was not supposed to fare well against COVID-19. In fact, it was supposed to, in theory, fail miserably. The most densely populated country in the world, when the most developed economies were struggling, what chances did Bangladesh have? Bangladesh, however, has its strengths. First, its tremendous resilience. Bangladesh has dealt with incredible odds and overcome them. Its very inception 50 years ago in 1971, under the leadership of the father of the nation, Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, through our glorious liberation war, is proof of that. The proof is re-demonstrated every year by growing at 8% despite catastrophic floods and cyclones, chipping away some economic gains. Second, the relentless focus on human development indicators such as women's empowerment, cutting down 70% maternal mortality and 80% child mortality, and halving poverty. The bold and dynamic leadership of Honorable Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina permeated to different tiers of government and society and galvanized widespread collaboration and unprecedented innovation to fast-track the country's rate of development. High growth and yet inclusive, self-dependent and yet collaborative, respectful of heritage and yet opportunistic in its use of new technologies, the country is poised to graduate from a least developed country status, but more importantly, by human development indicators, has already achieved a level of development commonly predicted for countries with twice its per capita income. And third, the inclusive, citizen-centric building blocks of societal and policy innovation, something the government invested in and built over the last decade, ushering in unprecedented transformation of digital public services, which has saved Bangladesh citizens nearly $10 billion to date in terms of reduction in time, cost, and number of visits it takes citizens to access government services. The COVID-19 pandemic was a new threat which demanded fast decision-making, flexibility, and a new way of doing government. Above all else, it required more than ever before listening to the citizens to understand what they required during this crisis for both life and livelihood. Government and private sector working together in an unprecedented way. Indeed, 80% of the development budget in the 8th five-year plan will come from the private sector. And repurposing policy Legos built over 12 years of digital Bangladesh to create new solutions in a matter of days. Let me give a few examples. Last year, with the nation in the grips of its first countrywide lockdown, only a couple of RT-PCR labs and hopelessly short of testing kits, the National Information Hotline 333 was repurposed as a COVID-19 helpline to enable millions of people without smartphones to self-report symptoms. In an organic way, 333 evolved into a telemedicine line that enabled over 500,000 COVID patients and 2.4 million pregnant women to receive medical advice. Moreover, the platform was repurposed several times more, including as an emergency response to curb child marriage and to provide food support to families facing food insecurity during lockdowns. It also formed the basis for a national collective data intelligence system that enabled secure sharing of anonymized data between telcos and government to launch syndromic surveillance to track disease progression 7 to 10 days before RT-PCR testing, helping save lives. Repurposing was the reason why, when the pandemic threatened to end all forms of education for 43 million students in the country, there was immediate response. While plenty of internet-based solutions existed, reliable internet for education purposes was only available to a fraction of students in the country, which meant that the large majority would be deprived. This is when the idea of repurposing Parliament TV came, what was once a TV station that was largely underutilized by airing Parliament sessions every few months, transformed into delivering thousands of daily lessons, a transformation that took just 6 days. The Teachers Portal was developed with the aim of introducing a modern approach to teacher training, devised for primary and secondary school teachers. This online social platform not only allowed for more efficient and modern methods of professional development for teachers, but also allowed a peer-to-peer component. Innovative procurement practices that allowed rapid procurement of digital content using teachers and startup companies saw the number of contents dramatically increasing to well over 500,000, and users on Teachers Portal jumped to nearly 600,000. And we saw all these platforms were made possible thanks to the joint efforts of Ministry of Education, Ministry of Primary and Mass Education, and the A2I, the Access to Information that Mr. Steiner talked about. However, we are aware that this is not enough and more needs to be done. COVID-19 has indeed made us aware the need of the need and the opportunity to create an education system that is adaptive, resilient, and anticipatory in response to this current pandemic and the crises ahead. This has made it urgent that our education system is both blended and comprehensive in design. We will make sure that all students have access to an inclusive learning system irrespective of their access to technology at home. The pandemic saw courts being shut, resulting in bail cases piling up, further crowding already overcrowded prisons, and lives endangered as a result. With the launching of digital courts in a matter of 12 days to hold virtual bail hearings, overcrowding prisons fell by 11% in 2 months. The pandemic also saw millions of people falling back into poverty and extreme poverty as their livelihoods were taken away. This is where a previous technology infrastructure for citizens to receive social welfare payments electronically was repurposed to a new expanded digital social safety net program to extend support to 5 million people of the new poor using eKYC tied to biometrically verified smart NID. 2021 marks 50 years of independence of Bangladesh and is also our watershed year to achieve the Digital Bangladesh mission, and we are well on our way. Economically, we have become a middle-income country, and we are poised for LDC graduation in the next few years and are planning to be a poster child nation of sustainable development goals achievement. Ultimately, Bangladesh's loftiest mission is to be achieved 20 years later as she seeks to become a poverty-free, high-income nation by 2041 on her path to realizing these Shonar Bangla or Golden Bengal of the father of the nation, Bangabandhu's dreams. Going forward, Bangladesh as a nation needs to expand the broad-based capacity to actively explore possibilities, experiment, and continuously learn as part of a broader inclusive governance system. People keep talking about building back better. We are making a commitment to take the best of both the digital and the physical and build forward better to a blended learning paradigm that is learner-centric, personalized, equitable, and inclusive. Through tiers of education up and down the socioeconomic echelons and across nations, leaving no one behind. I would like to conclude by thanking UNDP and A2I for introducing many of these innovations all across government departments through 1, repurposing of policy Legos, and 2, ushering in a culture of innovation that has taken hold in civil service, leading to a transformation of the bureaucratic mindset from a rules-driven system to a citizen-centric, responsive state apparatus, which has been most crucial during this pandemic. Once again, Mr. Steiner, distinguished panelists, guests, I thank you all. Joy Bangla, Joy Bangabandhu, may Bangladesh live forever.
Dr. Moni, dear Minister, thank you so much for, first of all, giving us a glimpse of the many different things that have happened in Bangladesh over the last 14 months, how central both government as an institution, but also a vision of how to respond to this crisis you have brought to it. And, you know, there is an interesting anecdote to the history of A2I, because it was actually a civil servant from within Bangladesh civil service who had participated in a training program, as part of which every participant had to come up with an idea of how to improve something in government. And the beginnings of this extraordinary portal that now covers all of Bangladesh and has allowed citizens to access digitally so many records was really the beginning of a civil servant saying we could do something differently, and looked at the power of ideas and innovation. It has transformed, as you have said, the mindset of government across all sorts of domains that would have been unimaginable, I'm sure, to that individual. I think it was about 10, 12 years ago or longer. Anyway, Dr. Moni, it is the holy month of Ramadan. We are standing between you and the breaking of your fast. So I want to release you because I know that you have other things on your mind right now. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to share our experiences. Thank you.
We are honored to have had you and look forward to continuing to work with you and many of your colleagues. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. It is now my pleasure to introduce a brief video message by His Excellency, the President of Colombia, Mr. Iván Duque Márquez, who has become an intellectual partner to a development community that is thinking well beyond the borders of Colombia about the future of development, about how to address some of these challenges. And within Colombia, in his own country, with the government still trying to move forward into a new era with a peace dividend, but also transforming Colombia's economy and the role of the government, President Duque Márquez has been a great ally. And so it is my pleasure to ask our colleagues to please play the video message. And just Dr. Kodjo, to let you know, for some reason, your screen has come up. I don't know if your microphone is on or someone's microphone. Everybody please mute. And colleagues, let's play the message from the President of Colombia. Thank you.
Quiero enviarle un saludo a Achim Steiner, administrador del PNUD, y a la profesora Mariana Mazzucato. Los gobiernos tenemos hoy la posibilidad de fortalecer las instituciones, diseñar políticas públicas y programas innovadores e implementar políticas sociales modernas para lograr una recuperación inclusiva y sostenible. Por ello, saludamos la presentación del documento que el PNUD ha redactado con la profesora Mazzucato y su equipo sobre las capacidades dinámicas del Estado. En medio de la pandemia, actuamos con rapidez y responsabilidad para fortalecer las políticas sociales. Estamos protegiendo a los más vulnerables, usando todas las capacidades institucionales y fortaleciendo la colaboración público-privada. Hemos beneficiado a más de 10 millones de familias con una inversión del 11% del PIB. Y Colombia ha mantenido programas como Familias en Acción, Jóvenes en Acción y Colombia Mayor para atender a los más vulnerables. Además, programas como Ingreso Solidario y la devolución del IVA, que fueron diseñados y llevados con urgencia a la población en situación de pobreza y vulnerabilidad, están beneficiando a cerca de 4 millones de hogares. Creamos el programa de apoyo al empleo formal, PAEF, mediante este subsidio directo que le permite al Estado colombiano otorgar mensualmente un aporte por empleado correspondiente al 40% del salario mínimo. Así, hemos protegido también a cerca de 4 millones de empleados. El PNUD estima que sin estas medidas, 2 millones de personas habrían caído en la pobreza y 4 millones en la pobreza extrema. Tenemos un ambicioso plan de recuperación económica sostenible y consciente en lo social que se llama Compromiso por Colombia. Contempla más de 550 proyectos que tendrán una inversión de cerca de 144 billones de pesos, con el que esperamos crear cerca de 2.5 millones de empleos formales. A la crisis hemos respondido con responsabilidad e innovación, sin caer en las falsas dicotomías entre la salud y la economía. Así lo seguiremos haciendo para impulsar la vacunación masiva, la reactivación segura y la transformación social sostenible. Agradecemos el apoyo constante del PNUD. Seguiremos trabajando juntos para impulsar el desarrollo de Colombia. Con ustedes, pensando en avanzar en la Agenda 2030, en seguir generando una cultura de desarrollo humano, saldremos adelante. Muchísimas gracias.
I thank President Duque Márquez for having taken a moment to record this message. As I said, he is an avid partner in thinking about the future development. When you're president, you know, many of us think you have all the means by which to make decisions, and yet decisions are based on ideas and on an understanding and appreciation of what has gone before us and what might come next. And it is therefore my great privilege now to invite Mariana Mazzucato, Professor in Economy of Innovation and Public Value at the University College of London, the Director of, and Founding Director, I should say, Mariana, of the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, author of her most recent book, Mission Economy, a Moonshot Guide to Changing Capitalism, a friend, a partner, a comrade, a influential voice that is shaping the way we think about what happens next. Mariana, it's a great privilege to present our Thinking Together report with you today. You have the floor and our listeners are ready to follow you. Over to you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Achim. It was absolutely wonderful to work with your team because, as you say, we're often on panels together talking. We hadn't yet actually collaborated on a piece of work, and this was a really exciting one. And I also want to really thank our colleagues from Bangladesh and from Ghana to be joining us on the panel, because I think the messages in the report, which I'll touch on in a minute, only make sense if we're actually learning what's happening globally, both the great stuff that happened, but also some of the real failures. I'm living in a country in the UK that has one of the highest death rates from COVID in terms of death per capita. But, you know, instead of just saying, oh, that's terrible, what can we learn? What, you know, how can we actually do it better next time? If you think of the huge amount of things that actually had to be done, in quotes, from test and trace to delivering personal protection equipment to frontline workers. So instead of just calling them essential and clapping them, actually making sure they were fully protected on the front lines, but also not just, you know, investing in the innovation for the vaccine, but actually making sure it was rolled out. And that itself, I think, was a really interesting lesson for the UK, because it was rolled out at the center of a decentralized network of different types of health institutions at the center of the NHS, but very much community-based. And that was different from how the test and trace system was or was not rolled out. And that actually happened through Deloitte, consulting company. So again, you know, things were done in different ways across the world. They are still being done in different ways across the world. So the big question of what works, what doesn't, how can we become more prepared next time? What the report does is it sets back a bit and says, what are we even talking about? We're talking about the need to do things, to produce, to govern, to collaborate in order to, for example, with the vaccine, to actually foster collective intelligence, right? Not just to allow, you know, a vaccine to be there and then actually not allowing citizens to have access to it. What does it mean to collaborate on the innovation in such a way that really is driven by concepts of, say, collective intelligence, and govern the patent system in such a way that delivers that, and so on. So what we do in the report is we really step back and say, this is a really big wake-up call globally for public sector capacity at the local level, the city level, at the regional level, at the national level, and definitely in terms of multilateral institutions, in terms of how to work together globally in order to both deal with the current crisis, but especially to be much better prepared next time. But also, of course, we should remember that the current crisis we're living through is just one of multiple crises. We are still, you know, many countries trying to get on their feet again from the financial crisis over 10 years ago, and there as well, there was lots of public money put into the system. Lots of that money actually just ended up back in the financial sector. It didn't stick on the ground in capable, able structures. But of course, the climate crisis, right, which again has a city level, a street level, a regional, a national, and an international dimension, that requires lots of different types of activities that we're not really prepared for. And we're seeing that, you know, Greta Thunberg, when she was 16, told, you know, global leaders, when your house is on fire, what do? You don't sit there and debate what to do, you get out quickly. So we are not moving at pace with the climate crisis. And in fact, I just saw some recent numbers of the COVID-19 recovery funds. Unfortunately, over 50% of the ones that have gone to energy projects have actually gone to fossil fuel driven ones. So anyway, so we step back and say, this is about rethinking the state, not in an old dichotomous way, as you rightly opened up with, you know, when you have kind of the state is great or the state is terrible, but really rethinking the public sector itself, public institutions within economies where the public sector isn't or shouldn't be there just to fix market failures. That's how economists talk about the role of the state, but actually really actively co-creating and co-shaping markets, but also co-creating value, right? This idea that wealth creation is just in business, and at best, a government minister or civil servant can enable, facilitate, or fix things when they go wrong, itself needs to be unpicked. Because in fact, if you look at the history of both technological change, but also the history of the ability of countries, which we talk about also in the report, to actually govern really difficult moments, that is not just about governing in terms of regulating and kind of ex post, trying to pick up the pieces. It's actually about creating value in a different way. So I just wanted to touch on, I've written here, 5 quick points that the report really tries to go deep down in. And that first point I just talked about, which is really about the narrative about value creation and the need within public institutions to both have, using your words, the license to be co-creating and co-shaping alongside other actors in the private sector, in the civil society sectors, but especially to be able to co-create value, to develop those really important, what we call in the institute I run, the dynamic capabilities of the public sector to do, as the minister talked about, to be agile, flexible, but to really do that in such a way that the tools themselves that we have on the ground, the grants, the loans, the procurement, which I'll get to later, are really designed in such a way that are trying to foster change and crowd in as much experimentation by different actors as possible. And notions of like public value themselves need to be thought about. We just had a meeting this week with colleagues from the BBC. The BBC is a public broadcaster, we all know, because we watch BBC News when we're traveling. It's a very trusted source. But as an institution, as a public institution, the BBC has always had a very dynamic debate within of what it meant to deliver public value, more than just filling the gap, say, of something the private sector is not doing. Had they done that, they would have at best created, documentaries and high quality news. They wouldn't have used this notion of public value and kind of thought leadership and co-creating markets in areas like soap operas and talk shows. And in fact, the fact they have made soap operas, which traditionally are just for, the private sector, meant that they cared about issues of diversity. They made sure these were also soap operas, for example, EastEnders, about the working class, and not just Dallas and Dynasty, about the 1%. If those of you who are as old as I am know, you will have watched those soap operas. Anyway, the point is, intra-organizational metrics, as well as narratives and stories about what it means to create value and not just kind of fix someone else's process. Secondly, this issue of the tools, if you are creating and co-shaping markets, what does it mean to really align tools in such a way that does that? In my recent book on mission economy, I looked actually at how NASA, the National Space Agency, used procurement when they were trying to get to the moon to be, it was very outcomes oriented. The goal was getting to the moon and back, but it left open the how. It wasn't micromanaging the process, but it also wasn't just saying, oh yes, of course we need the private sector to help us in space, because that itself is a good thing. Why is that in itself a good thing? What's good is to collaborate, but on what? A problem, right? So think of all the different problems with COVID, which we also talk about in the report, one of which is the digital divide, which we've seen, as the minister was referring to. It's simply not true that students continued globally to have access to their SDG human right of having access to quality education, because they had very different levels of access to the internet, to different types of digital technologies. So what would it mean to actually have missions that are about zeroing the digital divide in a particular location and really using public procurement, to foster as much different bottom-up innovations in order to achieve that. And that really does also mean, forming different types of public-private partnerships that are truly symbiotic and are truly mission-oriented, that we're collaborating on a problem, and the design of that collaboration reflects that. I'll come back to that later when I want to talk about what we're learning now with the vaccine, because those partnerships really matter. And if we're not doing it in a symbiotic way, you end up with problems that the World Health Organization today is rightly so screaming about, vaccine apartheid, but also the patent system really needs to be organized in a more collective way through patent pools if we care about things like collective intelligence. The third point is, this concept of essential workers. It was a word, I think, that was used in many different countries, and these were the frontline health workers, which, and again, in so many countries didn't have access to things like personal protection equipment. Many deaths occurred from the heroes who were, not just isolating at home, but in the hospitals. And there we have a real issue. And we've known this for a long time, but this is the moment to understand how to do things better, which is, what does it mean to talk about essential workers? What does it mean to value those workers? We have a measure of GDP, for example, globally, that still doesn't know how to do that very well. We often talk about government spending, public expenditure. We don't do what you were talking about, Achim, thinking about it as public investment. But that is not a coincidence. That is not, just like, oh, whoops, that's wrong. That's built into the system, that bias. Because we only include, for example, in GDP, those activities that have prices. If you do have, and unfortunately some countries don't, a free public health system, what does it mean to not just look at the prices of the inputs, the cost of nurses, of hospital beds, of public education, public school teachers, but also to really value the outcome and to use those valuation metrics that will be both qualitative and quantitative to really strive for the best public health system, the best public education system. But if we only know how to value the inputs, of course, we're going to see it as just expenditure and end up, cutting those costs in order to, create wealth in another part of the economy. So I think it's a real wake-up moment. The fact that we have the vocabulary to talk about essential services in the public sector, we must be actually valuing those services concretely and making sure that those services are really driven by long-term investment, not just last minute when we have a crisis, when it's basically too late. And I mentioned, this is my fourth point about, collaborations. We have to be governing these collaborations towards the public interest, right? If you talk to a biologist, they won't allow you to get away with lazy words like ecosystem, which both you and I use all the time. They'll say, sorry, what ecosystem? Is it predator prey? Is it parasitic? Is it symbiotic? Is it mutualistic? We don't know. We have ESG metrics in companies that are trying to help companies change their corporate governance. We don't necessarily have the same thing, inside government. Are government organizations changing? What are the metrics along things like public value that I mentioned? But also, what are the metrics to make sure that how we're working together is actually truly symbiotic? And this is where, it's really important to actually govern innovation, to democratize innovation, and to govern innovation, for example, around the vaccines that I already mentioned, towards, common good characteristics. So the people's vaccine, that itself will have to be governed in a particular way to make sure that the outcomes, on the back of huge amounts of public investment, by the way, the 6 vaccines we have out there have received over $12 billion in public investment. And often that investment was early stage, in the high risk, early entrepreneurial, capital intensive stage. And it's not that the private sector doesn't matter. Of course it does. And it's great. We have companies like Pfizer and AstraZeneca and so on. But the truth is they've come on the back of a lot of that public investment, and we failed to govern that innovation and those collaborations for the public good. And lastly, one of the key capabilities we talk about in the report, beyond this need to be agile, flexible, to use the tools to really co-create and shape and not just fix, and to really build these symbiotic ecosystems, we talk about basically the 21st century general purpose technology, which is digital and AI and big data. And we absolutely really need to learn from, on the ground, which countries were able really also to have a proactive, or are able to have a proactive governance relationship with data and digital platforms, and how can we actually, also perhaps invent, social innovations, not just technological innovations that help us govern that process better. You might know that the mayor of Barcelona, Ada Colau, brought hackers, computer hackers, into the city government to make a much more direct relationship with data as it's created, and the ability of the city to actually directly improve decisions being made around social housing, public transport, and so on. And so a proactive stance with digital governance, and also thinking about public digital platforms. This is also, there's a wave of innovation around this area, is very important. And again, really what we try to do in the report is then put the spotlight in places like Kerala, in Mongolia, in Vietnam, where actually some really interesting things happened, in Rwanda. One thing we don't do is talk about a lot of the failures, because it's a very positive report, but I think we should definitely remember that unless we have a framing of co-creation, of creating value, of the public sector and civil servants as wealth creators themselves, then we end up not investing within the public service. And one of the things we've seen, the bad lessons, is that this over outsourcing to, for example, consulting companies or other forms of private institutions of government capacity, leads to tragic outcomes. And it's not about not collaborating with the private sector, and it's not even about not outsourcing, but you don't outsource your brain, right? So your capacity to actually govern digital platforms, that's too central to outsource. So, some of the decisions and the capabilities that we talk about are, how to even make those decisions. And I'll just stop there and just to say, again, it was fantastic to work with your team. And we're especially interested also in the educational and training side of that. Our master's in public administration is trying to change how we think about the education and training needed on the ground, very much around these issues of co-creation of value, challenge-oriented policies, creative bureaucracies, not inertial ones, and really kind of that designed thinking around digital platforms at its core. So thank you so much.
Mariana, thank you. And on your last point, I think one reason why I'm so excited about our partnership is that, public institutions are full of innovators and entrepreneurial, public servants. They're often entrapped, they are disempowered, or they're not enabled. And I think part of the mission approach that you outlined, but also some of the lessons that we have learned from the study is what happens when you stop viewing government as unable to actually rise to a new challenge and a new task, and you empower government institutions. That doesn't always mean the president, doesn't always mean the minister. It may be your director general, it may be the health workers who are across a country, the front line of a health response. So thank you for that clarity and energy. Let me quickly turn now to our last presenter, who I want to introduce as the Director General of National Development of the National Development Planning Commission of Ghana, Dr. Kodjo Mensah-Abrampa. But Dr. Kodjo, you will also forgive me if I introduce you as a former colleague, comrade in arms of having worked at UNDP, UN Capital Development Fund. You have a long career, including at Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology, where you were teaching on development planning and management. But right now you are at the center of a stormy period in the world's development and also in Ghana's attempts to manage those. So Dr. Kodjo, over to you for a few minutes of insight on today's topic. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very, very much. This is a big opportunity for me, and I must thank my colleagues here at the public service system and also with the UN system that have been too very, very helpful through these processes, and also the UNDP in particular and UNICEF for the job that we've done for our country and for the world. Let me say that the COVID has a huge lesson for us and the biggest test I'm sure the public system in Ghana has ever gone through, because we've been a country which hasn't experienced a lot of these in terms of risk, and then in terms of also some of these pandemics and even conflict situations, not at all. And therefore, our public system has been quite irregular and working through as is expected, as usual, and the normal bureaucracies we'll find in almost every country. But going through this process, it first of all brought us the biggest challenge of learning to work with other partners within the country. The public system had to work for the first time closely with academic and research institutions. It brought us also a very key challenge of working closely with the private sector, not only seeing the private sector as a recipient and responding to the policies and regulation of the public system, but as a key partner in working through this process. It also has to see itself as a key partner in working with some of these decentralized institutions, local systems, traditional systems, and also working closely with all across the youth groups, across the age groups, the aged, the youth, and even the most, what we would term as the most vulnerable groups in this country, working along with them and learning from every one of us. What the president did at the beginning was to give us a task as a National Development Planning Commission to think through some of these issues which were only anticipated because it was seen as happening somewhere. But to be in an anticipatory move, to be in a situation where we anticipate and identify some of the potential risk we run into if it indeed happens to Ghana. So we went through a process of coming out with a lot of alternative scenarios. If it happened this way, this is what's going to happen. So as a commission, we developed a lot of papers. And these papers did not just rest on the desk. Immediately, it was taken up through a cabinet retreat. So the cabinet retreat have a full knowledge of some of the scenario that we need to anticipate, some of the risk areas, particularly thinking about the risk that may come up for the vulnerable group, the risk that may entail for our education system, the potential capacity challenge that the health sector might face. So we went through all this scenario, and through that, an effective plan was drawn, and to really respond to some of these issues which were coming up from other countries. So the COVID situation, when it hit Ghana, really brought a key assessment of the institutional capacity of the public sector, the skills that we have, the knowledge that we have, the ability to respond to some of these challenges, not only through our usual work, but also this time around to be able to adapt in certain key decisions at a very short moment to be able to respond to some of the challenges of the COVID. It also tested our system, how resilient it is. And to be frank, this is a country which has been, at that time, been growing at a very fast pace and seen as one of the fastest growing economies in the world, at growth rate at 8.5% in 2017, 6.5% in 2018, and even at 2019, 6.3% growth rate. And therefore, the system was seen to be quite regular and buoyant. But all of a sudden, the areas of growth was challenged economically. And therefore, we need to think about the best way to recover, the best way to get these things working, in spite of the fact that we may even need to shut down in certain areas. We may even need to be able to tone down in terms of interactions among institutions, among individuals who are even pushing the economy on these growth rates. One of the things which became very obvious was the challenge of coordination. Because then immediately you realize that there are problems coming up in almost all the phases of development, the private sector, the traditional sector, the public sector, and even with the research and academic institutions. So the National Development Planning Commission, that is where we need to immediately muscle up and come up with step up the regular process of engaging this institution, what we usually call the core planning sector groups. So we pull some of these institutions together so that we'll be able to harmonize and then bring it together the synergies, which would then help to sustain the running of the country and the economy through this process. In taking these decisions during these short moments, one of the things that became a key asset is data and information. And that is what I must thank the UN institutions for giving us a huge support in mobilizing whatever we have in order to receive this data, in order to receive this information, this data, and then also in order to process this data into tangible information which can support information and decision making at very short moments at the office of the president, at the coordinating committee for COVID, and then also not only that, also to give a feedback to research and academic institutions that are devoted a lot of their time and resources in responding to some of these COVID situations. So the health issues were tackled, the public institutional issues were dealt with because we realized that there were key systems and there were key capacity in terms of skill, knowledge, and ability. The challenge had to do with the private sector, because then we needed a lot of resources to be able to respond to the COVID. The PPEs, which were very, very vital, and a lot of these things hitherto were imported. How do we harness and mobilize the local private sector to be able to produce some of these things which were running short in many of our health institutions? And therefore, in doing that, we had to immediately think through some of these incentives for the private sector in areas which has to be responded to in fiscal terms, and these quick decisions with a very short moment. which means that as we take those decisions, we also needed to be mindful of the repercussions in other parts of the economy. And if you have you don't have a real coordinated system, it becomes very difficult to pursue this. The intersectoral demand that is being made by COVID also require that it is not just working at the health sector. You ought to follow in education. You ought to be thinking about communication. You ought to be thinking particularly about issues of food and food security. We need to be thinking about issues related to sanitation. We need to think about issues related to even housing. As for instance, a very good example was where we went into a lockdown. Then we realized that for many people in their households, they did not even have effective and easy access to sanitary facilities, even shops to buy food. And a lot of social amenities were also shared. And therefore, you ought to go outside your compound. Some of them, you ought to go beyond 500 meters to be able to get to the public tap to fetch water. All these had implications for us in terms of the nature of our housing, the nature of the management of our communities, and gave expression particularly to National Development Planning Commission in the spatial planning of these communities after COVID.
Dr.
So
Kodjo,
generally,
wrap up in about 1 minute, please. Sorry that
yes,
the time
yes,
is running.
yes. Thank you very much. Generally, we have to review our policies. We have to think through some of the legislation. We have to think through some of the regulations. We have to think through some of the institutional establishment and their relationship. We also have to think through particularly the issue of harnessing data, analyzing to obtain the information, and the usage of this data in very quick decisions. So I must say that going forward, this is a big lesson for us as a country, for the National Development Planning Commission. It's giving us a lot of information for planning in time ahead, and to also take into consideration risk in particular when we are planning, and also how to build resilience for some of these unanticipated and even anticipated issues. Thank you very much, and for this opportunity, particularly to UNDP Ghana and the UNDP Global. And thank you very much.
Dr. Kodjo, thank you so much. And, I'm reminded also, because just in the last few days, we have seen to some extent how a major international player in the digital economy has, opted to put their feet on the ground on the African continent in Ghana. We're talking about Twitter, and it reminds me a little bit what Mariana spoke to. I often use the term ecosystem. You're right. There is a qualitative dimension, but an ecosystem essentially speaks to creating or understanding, not creating, recognizing how different parts interact with one another. And I think part of the mission is both to have transformative impulse, but not ignorant of the context and of the other parts that play into that. And I think the digital frontier right now is one for Africa where we can see extraordinary futures potentially playing out or not. And I think we will watch how you and Ghana will continue to foster, let's say, that mission environment, if I may call it that. Very quickly, I will turn to Mariana. There were a number of questions, and I want to perhaps, without doing justice to the nature of the questions, put a comment back to you, Mariana. How do we relate that which I think we are trying to point the attention to, namely the ability, the capability, the value of the state, vis-a-vis the failure of the state? The report doesn't speak so much about the failure, but there is also in the mission narrative that you have fostered, in the way that we look at, NASA and things like this, sometimes perhaps a way of idealizing the state that does not reflect how citizens perceive their state to be. So if in 1 minute you can just point a little bit to where people can find more to think about this, because we are not trying to, I think, convey the sense of, the state is a perfect institution. It certainly isn't the answer to everything, as you already pointed out, but it's even more complicated. Very often it is the very failure of the state to play some of the roles that you spoke to, that I have alluded to, that actually are at the heart of development failure. So how do we deal with that reality? And again, in COVID, a couple of people who sent comments in are speaking to their reality at this very day in April 2021, and what they perceive to be a major failure of the state.
Yeah. So it's a very important point. And by the way, when my colleagues in Africa say, oh, Mariana, you're romanticizing the state, we have a weak state, I say, I'm from Italy, don't forget. We have problems. We've exported the weak state. The mafia The Italian Sicilian mafia, think of the Hollywood version, was set up because of the failed state. People actually set up the Società dei Beati Paoli, which was a self-help mutual organization because the state was not there. So the mafia is an outcome of a failed state. Anyway, at the time. So it's a really important question. My work with the South African government, I'm an advisor to Cyril Ramaphosa. We struggle with this issue all the time. And the really challenging thing is when you have problems in the state, and again, these are global, it's not in any one region, many state organizations are actually not set up in the way that we talk about, agile, flexible, having a portfolio approach, thinking about risk, as we were just hearing, which I thought was very eloquent. One of the reactions is, oh, well, then we just need to outsource this, again, to the McKinseys of the world. So to resist that and to say we need to build capacity in order to have better states. And that's why I always also go back to the curriculum, because capacity is not something you just buy at the shop. It is developed also by new thinking. And so we actually have the wrong framing, I really think, also at the level of the masters in public administrations, which have been fed by this idea of kind of public choice theory, new public management, which at best strives for notions of efficiency in the private sector. It doesn't actually develop new metrics like public value, which I talked about with the example of the BBC, which might have sounded random, but believe me, those are the hardest things to do. And that's part of that capacity formation. And so, one of the things that, for example, South Africa, we've been looking at is what does it mean to own something publicly, like say, Eskom, the big energy company. That should be ownership, not just to stay in place, the state owns, but state ownership to transform, to transition towards a green economy. That actually means we need conditionalities, not just in terms of public-private, which I often talk about, but public-public, right? And those public-public conditionalities with the new kind of social compact, which is always focused around transformation, requires a new relationship actually even between public organizations. And I'll just stop there because I know that our time is up. But the question is on point, and the point of the report is not to glorify the state, it's to say, hey, all these problems require different types of much more capable, innovative, and creative bureaucracies with the redesign of the tools on the ground. And we try to highlight how there's some interesting stories, but it really requires much more than that. And that's what we try to do in the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose.
Thank you, Mariana. And to those of you who want to follow the work further of Professor Mariana Mazzucato and the Institute, just to remind you, it's the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose at the University College of London, University of London. And obviously, I highly recommend that if you can get hold of Mission Economy, you will see that it is not idealizing the state, it is trying to learn the lessons of where states succeed and fail, but also to demystify and to perhaps challenge the simplistic notions of a state as a problem or a state as a solution. And I think what we have done together in this report today, and again, reminder the title, COVID-19 and the need for dynamic state capacities and international comparison, was to learn in the midst of a crisis live, where are institutions of the state responding and succeeding, and therefore also addressing some of the questions that have been put in our Q&A. And what do we learn to minimize failures in the future? Because failures are tragic, and COVID-19 in itself, a tragedy, has been amplified also by failures of the state that have compounded failures of our societies to deal with these issues. So as the United Nations Development Programme, much of our work always comes back to governance and how governance is a centerpiece of successful or unsuccessful societies. And that has not only to do with the state as a power, but with the license we give to state institutions to create the conditions in which we as citizens can succeed. And I want to end with a brief quote from the report, because I thought it was very good. It says, just a minute, I need to find again. What we are writing about is not about an approach to policymaking that is about top-down planning by an overbearing state. It is about providing a direction for growth, increasing business expectations about the future growth areas, catalyzing activity, self-discovery by firms that otherwise would not happen. And you mentioned the issue of climate change. If you want one illustration that both shows the centrality of the private sector, but also the enormous risk of attributing to the private sector an intergenerational responsibility to think and invest into the future, then take climate change, and it carries within all the seeds of what we're talking about in terms of risks, opportunities, and lessons learned. Mariana, dear Dr. Kodjo, and also to our colleague, the Minister of Education of Bangladesh, thank you so much. This was a quick insight into an ongoing world of learning about development, about the future, and not only in developing countries, Mariana. I think what you have also highlighted, this is something where we can all learn from each other every day, whether we are an industrialized country, a developing economy. These are shared areas for collaboration, cooperation, and learning. In that spirit, thank you so much, and Mariana, for the wonderful partnership. To everybody who joined us today, thank you for your time, and we wish you a good rest of the day, wherever you are. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Mariana.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Dr. Kodjo.